I'm Dr. Anne Mary Montero, medical psychologist, coming to you today with Psychology Works, ways to tap brain know-how and leverage this quickly to your advantage. This video is intended for high-stress professionals coping with occupational risks, work risks that have been made worse during the COVID-19 crisis, understandably. I'm going to give you some ways today to understand, add your understanding, I'm sure, of these risk factors and practical tips from psychological literature and from clinical experience that can help effectively reinforce your coping and diminish this risk. First, let me please say, you are vital and brave. My heart is with you, your own hearts of dedication, and you cannot overstate your importance now or really at any time. I know officials are working, and I'm sure you yourself are directly working to prevent harm medically and mentally to yourselves. I would add that this is, I think in terms of visuals a lot, and this often feels to me like balance in the saddle and not leaning too far forward or not falling too far back. Although healthcare providers in general tend to lean far in with the hearts of givers and incredible know-how and taking at the moment some very brave risks. This is also intended to expand focus to other high-stress professions such as attorneys, the folks working in the financial sector, and folks in education, as well as first responders bravely responding and placing themselves at the center of this very, very distressing time. So with that being said, this is intended to offer some information and some coping support for what research tells us works best, but in ways that I hope are not boring, don't sound like they don't apply to you or are not coming from a real human being, are broken down into manageable bites, things that you have time to implement and can see real change that makes a difference in your life with concrete coping. So powered by science and tested on the real front lines. I've been honored to work with patients, typically specializing in patients with chronic medical illness, so dealing with medical crises for more than 20 years. And that's why I focus on Psychology Works. It's an easy intersection to see the value that this field can contribute to, I hope, patient lives and to the lives of professionals as well. This is what psychology is, the science of human mind, our thoughts and feelings, as well as our behavior. And I don't know what can be more central to our experience than those. So let's leverage what we can to help folks feel better, I hope. So briefly, we're going to cover healthcare provider risk factors, why this is so much harder with COVID-19, and tips for what you can do within your reach to try to impact your experience to hopefully feel better even under similar circumstances. So with that being said, if you'd allow a brief moment on background, folks in high stress professions have already been at risk for burnout. I have been privileged to work with physicians for many years, and I know US physicians are at far greater risk of burnout than the overall population, approaching 40–45%, and it's unfortunately on the rise. Burnout is characterized by a sense of exhaustion or fatigue, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And this is importantly marked by a sense of distancing or disengagement, which we know has a negative impact not only on their efficacy and decision-making, but also on well-being, and stands to reason not only for providers, but for patients as well. Physicians and other providers, attorneys are at increased risk for burnout as well. Teachers and first-line responders, very similarly, and now with all of the upheaval and the structure of our functioning in society, typically with change comes some extra distress, and I'm sure we'll see many studies in the months and years to come on the specifics of how that's impacting those communities. Based on other national crises. We've been able to identify some very serious risks, mental health wise, for those populations, particularly first responders, physicians, and folks who are proximate to distress, such as 9/11. We know with SARS in the past that those who were proximate to treating patients who had the condition, as well as those who had some other specific factors, were at increased risk for both depression and anxiety, including trauma symptoms that lasted for many years in the future. And interestingly, one of the features of what they reported was concern about stigma, that since they had been treating patients was something that the general public was fearful about. Unfortunately, that haloed to stigma of those treating them as well. So all of this can contribute to burnout, which has very, very serious effects. Risk factors include increased, like an interaction between workload, as well as a sense of autonomy, the degree to which people can have control over their circumstances, with specialty risk increased with practice setting, poor work-life balance, sleep hygiene, the risk of medical errors or malpractice risk, and specifically patient characteristics and approach to death. So with Dr. Schoenefeld from Mayo, now Stanford, there has been some landmark national research around burnout, and particularly pointing to some of these factors as increasing the emotional exhaustion, as well as the depersonalization and loss of meaning or efficacy. This is particularly exacerbated with occupational risk for folks who work with chronic distressed populations, where expectations are superlative, and there's a sense of decreased locus of control. That means you can't fix or affect things around you as directly. And absolutely, all of that applies to the current circumstances. So it makes sense that the stakes are high. In addition, I would add that for those in high stress professions, typically that attracts high achieving personalities, which are more prone with superlative self-expectations to experience anxiety. And with anxiety, often we focus on the differential between what we envision and what is. Instead of, for example, focusing on just arbitrarily the 94% that was right, we may hone in on the 6% of gap we perceive between what we want, what we got, and what we wanted. And so that narrow focus can add to distress and accelerate burnout risk. I would also add the important caveat within the literature. I really appreciate the phrase that has been published, beware the con of individual resilience, meaning don't overlook responsibility of the larger concentric rings around individual coping, like institutions where these providers work, or our overall community for their part. In other words, this is not solely on individual employees or providers' shoulders to manage and correct for all this risk. So it's operating in context. Okay, in addition to the expectational demand, we now have the current circumstances with COVID. The research that has been done to date has identified specific risks to healthcare providers in the COVID-19 environment, and this includes schedule disruption, extended work hours and complexity, isolation from family, and the role of the provider at home that would typically be occurring if the provider were able to flexibly or routinely go back and forth between work roles and home roles. This, by the way, is especially complex in two-physician families. And of course, there's the obvious worry about contagion for self and others, and the overall uncertainty of the COVID-19 environment despite all efforts. And unfortunately, this is already exacting quite a toll. Some 72% of medical providers surveyed acknowledged psychological distress, with half of physicians endorsing at least mild depression, 15% moderate or severe, and almost half with anxiety. These are enormous numbers. It stands to reason intuitively that providers are at increased risk, and I've been heartened to see the expression of thanks for healthcare providers, but we are all aware that this is a slower moving or slower publicized crisis that will likely unfold for years to come, taking cues from other medical crises or national crises like SARS or 9/11. It stands to reason also, just as burnout rates are somewhat paralleled in other high stress professions, that the rates of depression and anxiety may also be exacerbated in professions where those were already high, such as for attorneys. So we want to bear in mind the risk to providers and workers in all kinds of high stress professions and ways that we can work to protect or mitigate those stress factors. That being said, psychology encompasses focus on ways to be proactive with positive psychology and health psychology, that we know how to leverage the know-how we have to help move toward the common good for someone. We work with the framework of something called the biopsychosocial model. This in brief means that we account for not just one factor, but physical or medical, mental and emotional, and social and behavioral factors that all lead into the human experience. So with that in mind, we think of that as like a lens to provide recommendations in each of those domains. In the context of COVID-19, formal recommendations from academic medical centers have been forthcoming and include, for example, from Johns Hopkins with their RISE program, physical rest breaks from care in a separate place and with availability of psychological support, with, by the way, suggestions to bring behavioral health experts, not only available for provider well-being, and I would again add that that is logically congruent also for other high-risk professions, but at Johns Hopkins, they were also recommending engaging those behavioral health experts for logistical decision-making, for example, to help keep people calm while they're in line for testing. The CDC recommendations include hiatus breaks from news with attention to physical care and psychological needs, including relaxation or time to unwind. Physically, our field has identified best effect sizes associated with sleep protection, and keeping a consistent flow offers control and predictability. So we want to have a regular routine to follow to prepare for bed with the same activities in roughly the same order that can behaviorally cue us for sleep. And if you find that you are unable to sleep after 15 or 20 minutes, they recommend getting up, doing another activity that's soothing and low stress, and also not exposed to the blue light of computer screens. So even our phones or TVs can contain this. But then, and maybe even getting yourself a protein snack or something that's soothing, that can allow you then to settle back in bed and attempt to sleep again within that ideally 15, 20-minute time frame. So bearing in mind, focus on sleep, also focus on exercise, even gentle stretching or yoga-like activities can make a difference. Obviously, cardiovascular activities, if you're medically in a position to do so, can help increase energy and protect against mental and medical effects, including protection of sleep. Psychological recommendations. So at the top of that pyramid, focusing on mental and emotional well-being, I would focus in on meaning. Why am I doing what I'm doing? For folks in essential professions, especially healthcare providers, but again, also attorneys, folks in the financial industry, and certainly education and frontline providers. the stress is enormous. Engaging in meaning making can contribute greatly to both emotionally counterbalancing some of that risk, but also helping you engage in present attentiveness, meaning focus on the now. Why are you doing what you're doing at present? Studies have shown that the greater degree to which we attend to the present moment correlates directly with our mood and some anxiety ratings. So the more that we can keep our brains centered, like I mentioned earlier, in the saddle, instead of leaning too far forward with focus on the future or reeling too far backward with views to the past. Forward is associated with anxiety and future events, and backward with depression more commonly. And with that in mind, the degree to which you can stay centered and balanced with the present moment, albeit stressful, it can help you engage your resources to cope and have a better mood experience. Mindfulness is the psychological movement to help tune into current thoughts without judgment. Although recent literature cautions if the frontal lobe is too active, like with anxious rumination, that it's better to help distract yourself. For example, using apps like Calm.com or guided imagery, easily available on YouTube. So those are some resources for mindfulness and meditation. And then lastly, I would add behavioral engagement can go a long way to support coping and well-being, giving yourself activities to do. I try to focus with patients on 3 domains. We'll break it down into head, hands, and whole body, and come up with almost like a menu of activities that we can do that can help both get your mind off of things that are distressing and fully engage your brain in something that will afford you a sense of control. If it's reasonably small projects, it can give you a sense of completion, that satisfaction or control fix, if you will. And those things can halo in turn to mood and anxiety benefits. I will train patients with anxiolytic breathing. That is essentially just deep diaphragmatic breath. I teach the rhythm of 3-3-5, so you can inhale through your nose, hold it deep, lower lobes of your lungs, and then exhale longer so that you can activate the parasympathetic calming response. I ask all my patients to do that proactively if they can 3 times a day, working their way up from 5 or even 2 toward 10 or 15 minutes. If you can train your body to regularly calm itself and come back down, that will halo to anxiety, and that parasympathetic calming will be well rehearsed and a tool that the more you use it, the stronger it will become, and the more rapidly you will feel that benefit from it. If you are time pressed, as most high achieving professionals are, I would recommend a couple things for rapid neuroplasticity. That's the ability to reshape our brain. For example, in only 2 minutes, I loved this study, in only 2 minutes for 21 days, you could accomplish brain reshaping by doing a couple of things. 3 novel gratitudes in writing. The study's been touted a lot, but having 3 things that you're grateful for that you physically write down, if not mentally focus on, but that there's great support in the literature for physically writing. Also journaling, and I would add with that to physically put it away, so it's practically and symbolically out of reach when you are done. Using exercise, meditation, or random positive acts, all can have neuroplastic effects on the brain. And for the time challenge, if you could only pick 2 things, I would encourage you to do the deep breathing and then mental reframing at the top of that biopsychosocial model. So you shift your camera lens to refocus, whether that's on meaning making or just more realistic and positive interpretations of events. For example, with COVID, that it is isolated to time and to circumstance. This will not last forever, and that you have the coping skills to endure as you have endured many other stressors, albeit that this is unique, this one at present. So I applaud the efforts and stand in awe together with our community of healthcare providers and other essential workers, especially those at the front lines. For anyone who is having more serious thoughts of severe mood symptoms or anxiety symptoms, certainly any emergent needs you want to attend to immediately and access emergency resources in the community or within your organization. And if nothing else, the ER 911 or emergency resources available to us all. So I'd recommend those if your own resources are not sufficient to help safely keep those in check or eliminate those thoughts. I would activate emergency resources right away. Hopefully those are not needed, and I would end on a note of focusing on meaning making. My friend and colleague, Dr. Shelley Johns, was recently interviewed and made a statement I thought was very profound. She said, living intentionally in alignment with your values can ignite meaning and purpose even when fear is present. For example, with the COVID-19. So focusing on what is within your control, present realities, and continuing focus on your skills despite the stressors to continue coping and moving forward is an emphasis I would sure support. So from my mind to yours, I'm Dr. Montero. Thank you for your time to review these. I wish you well.